Now, several dozen big corporations, big businesses here in Washington state have come out against the Democratic plans to tax, and then tax some more, then wait a second and say, oops, we forgot to tax even more. They're out in a significant way in ways that they generally don't come out when it comes to anything that might be deemed a little bit too controversial politically. In fact, they donate tons of money to Democratic causes or candidates. That's the reality. But perhaps now they finally realize that was a big mistake, that it was the Republicans who are actually trying to back big business and business in general, which of course backs the workers, and not the Democrats, because the Democrats introduced what? Payroll tax, wealth tax. And these companies said, no. That's not good. And so they wrote a letter, and this was a letter that was delivered after Governor Bob Ferguson yesterday announced that he was not going to back either Democratic budgets, the one coming from the House nor the one coming from the Senate. And when I say that these are the heavy hitters in the state, I mean across the board. Both businesses that traditionally have been seen as very leftist and some that maybe have been kind of flirting with maybe being kind of conservative, or at least more understanding of the conservative viewpoint. We're talking Amazon, Microsoft, Alaska Airlines, Costco, the Mariners, and weirdly enough, Puget Sound Energy. That was an interesting one. Puget Sound Energy is coming out and saying, whoa. Even though they're the reason why we're getting hit with the Climate Commitment Act tax. But now they're saying, whoa, slow your roll. They're asking leadership to review and revise the budget. This is what they wrote. These proposals would result in the largest tax increases in state history, perpetuating a dangerous trend of unsustainable spending growth. Over the past decade, the state operating budget has more than doubled, with a 37% increase in just the last 4 years. This growth far exceeds state increases in population, inflation, and personal income, threatening our economic stability. Now, while Bob Ferguson has come out against the wealth tax, he did leave the door open to a tiny wealth tax just as a test case in front of the courts to see how the courts are going to react. But as he said yesterday, no, we don't want to be basing an entire budget on, potentially hundreds of millions of dollars that aren't going to exist. Doesn't make sense. But he also didn't take a position on the payroll tax. He chose not to take a position there, which is precisely why this letter is so important. They wrote, yesterday, we were encouraged by the governor's announcement that he would not sign the proposed wealth tax. We support the 5 priorities he outlined as fiscally responsible in these unprecedented times, such as preserving the state's rainy day fund. And we agree with the governor that we cannot just tax our way out of here. But then they say, even with no new taxes, existing revenue sources are projected to rise by a healthy 6.8% in the 2025 through 2027 biennium, and 7.7% on top of this in the 2027 to 2029 biennium. Given this, we believe it is a mistake to enact, as proposed last week, billions of dollars of additional tax increases with the apparent goal of growing tax revenue by almost 15% in the next 2 years alone. Now, these coalitions of businesses basically warned what conservatives have been warning about for a long time. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if we found out like Travis Couture wrote this letter for all the businesses, or Chris Gildon wrote this, or Nikki Torres wrote this, because it reads like it was written by Republicans, not because it's inherently partisan or political, but because it just makes sense. And when it comes to the economy, when it comes to fiscal issues, Democrats just are off the deep end. We want to maintain and grow jobs here in Washington and ensure our companies thrive in its diverse communities. However, in a global economy, capital and jobs are more mobile, migrating from market to market. For example, it's 30% less expensive to employ a software engineer in Vancouver, BC than in the Puget Sound. What is that threatening? It's not all that subtle, is it? You pass a payroll tax, we're going to move jobs. That's inevitably going to happen. In fact, they reference in this letter what we covered last week in Seattle with Mayor Bruce Harrell making the announcement that the projections on the Jumpstart Seattle payroll tax was 47 million short. Why? The city acknowledges businesses moved their jobs out of Seattle. What do you think is going to happen at the state level? They're making it clear. Now, the business community on this has been very vocal as of late, haven't they? We don't normally hear from big business in this way. They kind of just work behind the scenes and that's about it. But not this time, because it is so perilous for them. And that's why, for example, Brad Smith is out there doing the rounds, although weirdly not on this show. What's up with that? I own a Surface.
Did you wrong him some way?
Probably. I think I said I like the Australian soccer player Brad Smith way more than the Microsoft president Brad Smith. But he was on with Como and he said, yeah, we're pretty united against these budgets. It's a little bit crazy.
Well, the entire business community in this state is absolutely united.
By the way, except probably Molly Moons. I'm sure they'll come out and say, we like the taxes. Tax us more, please.
We care deeply about what our state government does for the public, but the proposals from the legislature for this year's budget go too far. They spend more than we can afford as a state. They have tax increases that are too high. And our view as the business community, really as the economic engine of this state, is that these tax proposals will undermine the economy.
Yep.
They are a threat to jobs. They will force businesses to pass on to consumers higher prices that consumers should not have to pay. We are asking the legislature to think again.
To think again. Now, whether or not they're going to think again, I don't know. They're obviously getting pressure from the business community in a significant way. Again, you don't normally see this kind of move. And oftentimes it's, let's just let Amazon do it. They've shown some interest in dipping their toes in this. And then if there's any pushback, any blowback, they'll take it and we don't have to. This time they're speaking out in a big way. And again, this should tell you how problematic the payroll and wealth taxes are to business.
The payroll tax would be a tax on jobs. It would make it harder to keep jobs in this state or create new jobs. The wealth tax, in our view, would cause people to leave the state. It would undermine entrepreneurship. It would discourage people from starting new companies in Washington state. It would be bad for the economy.
It would be bad for the economy. And people are going to feel the pain. And these businesses, I'm sure Democrats will argue, well, they never want to pay any taxes. They're already getting out of paying taxes. No, they're not. No, they're not. I know Danny Westneat in the Seattle Times today was doing his level best to pretend that we're a tax haven. Did you know we were a tax haven?
Really? It doesn't feel like it.
No, it's because it's not. It's because he's making it up. Or at least the person he was quoting. I think it was Jacob Vigdor from the University of Washington. But the reality is you're going to kill jobs and you're just going to push wealthy people out of it.
The interesting thing about the wealth tax is that it is not a new or novel concept. 13 countries across Europe adopted precisely this type of tax in the 1980s, and almost all of them ended up abolishing it because they all had the same experience. This type of tax across Europe destroyed jobs. It caused people with financial wealth to leave countries. It led companies to get started in other places. We should learn from that experience rather than repeat it.
What's curious to me, Jackson, is that it kind of feels like progressives and socialists have a tendency to try to replicate bad ideas from Europe that have already failed and then pretend that we don't have a whole bunch of history. Because it's not just this. Immediately what kind of came to mind was universal basic income, which was tested in a very significant way. It was studied in Finland. And it was a total disaster, at least if you're going to define it by what you originally said the successes were, or what would be seen as a success. And they said, the reason why we want to do this is we want to make it so that people can find a job. And this makes it a lot easier for them to still survive while getting maybe the necessary education or skills that they would need, maybe taking off the pressure for paying for childcare, things like that. And while it made people happy, they didn't, doubt that to begin with, but they had data that says people are X% happier as a result. I write about it in my book. And they still come back and say, but it's still not worth it because it's incredibly expensive and it's not leading to more people working, which is kind of a key point. Now, of course, socialists here in the Seattle, Tacoma region, they say, oh, no, we don't want them working. We just want to give them money. We want to take it from the wealthy and redistribute. And what's the whole thing about redistribution of wealth? What is that ideology again?
Socialism.
Oh, okay. So what was it? Say again?
Socialism.
Okay. But the left tells us they're not socialists. They love capitalism. And I suppose they love big business only in the sense that they love taking money from big business. And again, for all of these companies to come out like this, we're talking including Cherry Point Refinery, Washington Trust Bank, Paccar, Weyerhaeuser, Vulcan, Zillow, T-Mobile, Redfin. These are the biggies. And if they are all speaking out in a way that they traditionally don't, dare I say it's worth paying attention to.